The plantation owner gave his obese daughter to the slave, a decision that would change lives forever. What transpired next became a tale whispered throughout generations, challenging everything they thought they knew about power and humanity. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The air hung thick as molasses over Cypress Grove Plantation that April morning in 1841. Sweat beaded on foreheads and dampened collars as Silas Rutledge stood on the veranda, his imposing figure casting a long shadow across the assembled household. The plantation owner's face betrayed no emotion as he made his announcement, words falling like stones into still water. "My daughter Catherine will henceforth be under the care and authority of Ezekiel Cross," Silas declared, gesturing toward the tall enslaved man standing apart from the others. "Her condition requires specialized attention." The white staff exchanged glances of horror and disbelief. Mrs. Harlow, the housekeeper, pressed a handkerchief to her mouth, while Mr. Finch, the overseer, clenched his jaw so tight a vein pulsed at his temple. The enslaved workers kept their eyes lowered, faces carefully blank, though tension rippled through their ranks. Catherine Rutledge sat slumped in a wheelchair, her once delicate frame now swollen from years of mercury and laudanum treatments. Her pale skin had a waxy sheen, and her unfocused eyes seemed to see nothing. Only the slight tremor in her hands betrayed any awareness of her surroundings. Ezekiel stepped forward, his expression betraying nothing of the calculations racing through his mind. He had tended to the sick before, but this was different. The daughter of the man who owned him, placed under his care. A trap, perhaps, or something else entirely. "You understand what's required," Silas said. Not a question, but a command. "She's to be weaned off her medications, made presentable again." The young woman flinched at her father's words, a flash of lucidity crossing her face, before disappearing again beneath the fog of addiction. As Ezekiel wheeled Catherine away from the main house toward the small cottage at the property's edge, whispers erupted behind them. The cook, Mabel, watched from the kitchen doorway, her knowing eyes meeting Ezekiel's for just a moment. "Lord have mercy," she murmured, making the sign of the cross. By sundown, gossip had spread beyond Cypress Grove. In drawing rooms across Colleton County, plantation owners and their wives speculated over brandy and tea. "Rutledge's gone mad," they said, "giving his own flesh and blood to a slave's keeping. That poor girl has been an embarrassment for years," others whispered, "locked away like a secret, and now this." None understood the truth. As Ezekiel helped Catherine into the small bed in the cottage, their eyes met briefly. Something passed between them, recognition perhaps, or the shared knowledge that this strange arrangement was neither kindness nor madness, but something far more calculated. "They think they know," Catherine whispered, her first coherent words in months, "but they don't see the storm coming." Ezekiel nodded slowly, understanding that this moment was not his curse, but perhaps a door opening to something neither of them could yet fully grasp. The small room at the edge of Cypress Grove Plantation had been a storage space for broken furniture and forgotten belongings. Now, it served as Catherine Rutledge's prison and sanctuary. Ezekiel Cross had prepared it meticulously, a straw mattress covered with clean linens, a bucket of fresh water, and herbs he'd gathered in secret from the surrounding woods. The withdrawal began on the second night. Catherine's body, long dependent on the mercury treatments and laudanum her father had prescribed, revolted violently. She thrashed against the thin blankets, her nightgown soaked through with sweat. Her screams threatened to alert the main house until Ezekiel pressed a cloth gently against her mouth. "You must be quiet, Miss Catherine," he whispered. "Your father cannot know how bad this gets." Through the long nights, Ezekiel bathed her forehead with cool water and forced her to drink broth when she could keep it down. When the convulsions were at their worst, he held her wrists to prevent her from harming herself, his strong hands gentle but unyielding. The laudanum's grip was fierce, and Catherine begged for just one drop to ease her suffering. "I cannot," he would say, his voice steady. "That poison is what keeps you in chains." In moments of clarity, Catherine watched him work. Ezekiel moved with purpose, grinding herbs and mixing tinctures as he hummed softly. Sometimes, when the pain subsided momentarily, she heard him praying in a language she didn't understand, Gullah words passed down from his grandmother, who had been a healer before being brought to these shores in chains. But the physical torment was only half her battle. As the drugs left her system, memories Catherine had suppressed came flooding back. She saw masked men in the woods behind the plantation, heard chanting that made her blood run cold. In her fever dreams, she recalled a ritual chamber beneath the main house, where Silas and other county gentlemen gathered, their wheat sheaf rings catching the light of black candles. "They made me watch," she sobbed one night, clutching Ezekiel's arm. "The brethren, they made me." Her caretaker's expression changed then, a flash of recognition, quickly masked. He knew of the brethren of the harvest. Everyone enslaved at Cypress Grove did, though none spoke of them aloud. By the end of the first week, Catherine began to understand that Ezekiel was not simply following her father's orders. There was purpose in his eyes, knowledge behind his careful questions about what she remembered. He wasn't just healing her body. He was waiting for something. "Why are you helping me?" she asked during a moment of lucidity. Ezekiel studied her face before answering. "Because, Miss Catherine, our survival depends on each other now." The late April evening descended on Cypress Grove Plantation with a peculiar tension in the air. Silas Rutledge had transformed the dining hall into a theater of his own making, crystal chandeliers casting unforgiving light on the mahogany table where Colleton County's most prominent families gathered. The plantation owner moved between his guests with calculated charm, his voice carrying across the room as he described his progressive experiment with theatrical flair. Catherine Rutledge entered the room on unsteady legs, her once voluptuous frame now diminished by weeks of painful withdrawal. Sweat beaded at her temples despite the cool evening breeze. Behind her, Ezekiel Cross maintained a precise distance, close enough to intervene if needed, far enough to appear properly subordinate. The young woman's fingers trembled as she took her seat, aware of the 20 pairs of eyes studying her every movement. "My daughter has shown remarkable improvement," Silas announced, gesturing toward Catherine with his wineglass. "Ezekiel's methods have accomplished what Charleston's finest physicians could not." The assembled guests murmured polite appreciation, though their sideways glances betrayed their discomfort. Mrs. Harrington, wife of the county judge, pressed a handkerchief to her lips as though the very sight of the arrangement might contaminate her. The judge himself studied his plate with unusual intensity. "How exactly does this arrangement function day to day?" asked Thomas Bellamy, his fingers absently turning the wheat-emblazoned ring on his right hand. Ezekiel kept his eyes lowered, his expression carefully neutral. Yet every muscle in his body remained alert, cataloging the men who wore the telltale rings of the brethren. He counted 5 among the 12 gentlemen present, each one watching him with the cold calculation of predators assessing a potential threat. Catherine sipped water with shaking hands. "Ezekiel has been most diligent in his care," she managed, her voice stronger than her father had anticipated. "The laudanum fog has finally lifted." Silas's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. The cook entered with a tureen of soup, and Mabel's eyes briefly met Ezekiel's as she served the guests. The silent exchange lasted only a moment, but contained volumes of shared understanding. As the evening progressed, wine loosened tongues and heightened the underlying current of danger. When Catherine excused herself briefly, Bellamy leaned toward Ezekiel. "You understand the responsibility you've been given?" he said quietly, his words shaped like a question but delivered as a threat. a white woman's welfare in your hands." "I understand my place perfectly, sir," Ezekiel replied, each word carefully measured. Across the table, 3 other Brethren members exchanged glances, their rings catching the candlelight as they raised their glasses. Their eyes held something beyond mere suspicion, a dark knowledge, a shared secret that hung in the air like the scent of gunpowder before a shot. The early May sunshine filtered through the gauzy curtains of Catherine's room at Cypress Grove Plantation. For the first time in years, her mind felt clear, the fog of laudanum and mercury treatments finally lifting. She sat up in bed, her nightgown hanging loosely on her frame. She clutched it to her chest, remembering how she had written in it during moments of clarity between doses, desperate attempts to document what she had witnessed before the drugs pulled her back under. The plantation house felt eerily quiet as she returned to her bed, the journal heavy with secrets. When Ezekiel returned with a tray of herbal tea, Catherine was waiting. The caretaker set down the steaming cup and studied her face, noting the unusual alertness in her eyes. "I have something," she whispered, glancing nervously at the door. "Something they don't know survived." The enslaved man closed the door softly before approaching. Catherine opened the journal with reverence, revealing pages filled with cramped handwriting, some entries neat, others scrawled in haste. Symbols and codes lined the margins, dates circled with frantic precision. "I wrote it all down," she explained, her voice gaining strength. "The meetings in the woods, the men with wheat sheath rings, my father and his friends, what they call the Brethren of the Harvest." Ezekiel's expression remained carefully neutral, but his eyes betrayed recognition. He had seen those rings, heard whispers of midnight gatherings where decisions affecting the entire county were made in secret. "Some nights I would follow them," Catherine continued, turning to a page marked with a crude drawing of an underground chamber. "They thought I was too addled to understand, but I remembered. I encoded it all." She pressed the journal into Ezekiel's hands, her fingers brushing against his calloused palms. "If you want the truth about what happened to your family, about what my father has done, it's all here. But you have to help me remember the code. The laudanum took parts of my memory." Their eyes met in silent understanding. This journal wasn't just Catherine's ramblings. It was evidence, perhaps the only record of the Brethren's activities in Colleton County. "We'll need to be careful," Ezekiel finally said, his voice barely audible. "If Silas discovers this—" Catherine nodded, her face set with determination. "I know, but I'm tired of being their secret keeper." The night wrapped Cypress Grove Plantation in a heavy blanket of humidity. Catherine Rutledge's hands trembled as she clutched a small lantern, its flame dancing precariously with each shaky step. Beside her, Ezekiel Cross moved with practiced silence, his eyes constantly scanning for any sign of movement from the main house. "We need to hurry," he whispered, guiding her toward the cellar doors. "The overseer makes rounds before midnight." Catherine nodded, her recently cleared mind still adjusting to the sharpness of unmedicated reality. The laudanum fog had lifted enough for her to remember fragments, whispered conversations, strange gatherings, her father's hushed instructions about keeping the ledger safe. The cellar doors creaked as Ezekiel eased them open. The smell hit them immediately: damp earth, mildew, and the sickly sweet scent of fermenting grain. Catherine's stomach lurched, but she pressed forward, following her guide down the worn wooden steps. "There," she pointed with a trembling finger. "Behind the cornmeal barrels. Father always warned everyone to stay away." Ezekiel moved several rotting barrels aside, revealing a small alcove in the stone wall. His fingers probed the loose mortar until a brick gave way. From the cavity, he extracted a package wrapped in oilcloth. "Is this it?" he asked, unwrapping the bundle with careful hands. What emerged made Catherine gasp: a thick ledger bound in calfskin, its cover stained with suspicious dark patches. The book felt unnaturally heavy as Ezekiel placed it on an upturned barrel and opened it under the lantern's glow. Page after page revealed the true nature of the Brethren of the Harvest. Names, dates, locations, all meticulously recorded in different handwritings. Rituals described in clinical detail. Sacrifices catalogued with disturbing precision. Blood offerings, midnight ceremonies, victims. These are Colleton's most respected men, Catherine whispered, recognizing names of judges, landowners, and merchants. Her finger stopped at one particular signature, a flourish she had seen on letters and documents her entire life. My father. Ezekiel's face remained stoic, but his hands tightened on the ledger's edges. This is what they've been hiding. This is why they drugged you when you started asking questions. Catherine turned another page and suddenly clutched her throat, a memory surfacing with violent clarity. I saw them once, in the woods. I thought it was a nightmare from the mercury treatments. The last pages contained financial records, payments, bribes, blackmail. The Brethren's influence extended far beyond spiritual corruption. They controlled the county through a web of threats and blood money. We can't let them know we found this, Ezekiel said, carefully rewrapping the ledger. Not yet. Catherine nodded, her face pale in the lantern light. This changes everything. If people knew, people would hang us before believing it. He replied, securing the ledger in its hiding place, but removing several pages as evidence. But now we have their secrets, and secrets are power. The carriage wheels crunched on the gravel drive as Silas Rutledge returned from Charleston 3 days earlier than expected. The plantation house stood silent in the gathering dusk, but the cellar door had been left slightly ajar. A careless mistake that would prove costly. Catherine and Ezekiel had been so absorbed in deciphering the calfskin ledger that they failed to hear the approaching footsteps. The cellar door flew open, flooding the dim space with lantern light. Silas Rutledge stood at the threshold, his imposing figure casting a long shadow across the earthen floor. What in God's name is happening here? His voice was dangerously quiet at first, but quickly rose to a thunderous roar. My own daughter and he spat the word, property, conspiring behind my back. Catherine clutched the ledger to her chest, her hands trembling. Father, please. Silence. Silas slammed his walking stick against a barrel, sending a cloud of dust into the air. You were supposed to be recovering, not digging through my personal affairs. His eyes darted to the ledger, recognition dawning in them. Where did you find that? Give it to me now. Ezekiel stepped forward, positioning himself between Catherine and her father. Mr. Rutledge, your daughter is much improved. The laudanum was poisoning her mind. You dare speak to me as an equal? Silas's face contorted with rage. I'll have you whipped until there's nothing left but bone, and this ungrateful child will be back on her treatment by morning. But Ezekiel didn't flinch. Instead, he gestured toward the open pages of the ledger. We know what the Brethren of the Harvest truly is. We've seen the names, the dates, the rituals. His voice remained steady. If anything happens to either of us, copies of these pages will find their way to Charleston. The plantation owner's face drained of color. For a moment, the only sound was the distant call of whippoorwills in the cypress trees. You're bluffing, Silas finally whispered, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. Test me, Ezekiel replied. Silas paced the cellar, his mind visibly racing. Finally, he stopped, a calculating look replacing his fury. Perhaps we can reach an accommodation. The Brethren always needs new blood, men who understand discretion. He turned to Ezekiel. You will be initiated. You will swear the oath. And your loyalty will determine whether Catherine continues her recovery or returns to her previous state. Catherine gasped. Father, you can't. It's done, Silas snapped. Ezekiel will join us at the next gathering. Until then, the ledger stays with me. He extended his hand, waiting. Ezekiel and Catherine exchanged a glance loaded with unspoken meaning. Slowly, she handed over the damning document. Remember, Ezekiel said quietly as Silas tucked the ledger under his arm. We've read enough. 3 days after the confrontation in the cellar, Ezekiel Cross received a folded note slipped beneath his door. The message, written in elegant script on expensive parchment, directed him to a clearing in the woods beyond the eastern boundary of Cypress Grove at midnight. No signature adorned the paper, only the faint impression of a wheat sheaf stamped into the wax seal. As darkness fell, Ezekiel made his way through the dense undergrowth, guided only by the pale light of a quarter moon. Spanish moss hung like specters from the ancient oaks, swaying in the warm night breeze. The humid air clung to his skin as he approached the designated spot where flickering lantern light now penetrated the darkness. 7 men awaited him in a semicircle, their faces partially obscured by ornate masks. Ezekiel recognized Silas Rutledge by his distinctive posture, rigid and commanding, even in silence. The other men were prominent figures in Colatin County: a judge, 2 wealthy merchants, a doctor, and others whose power shaped the region's destiny. Ezekiel Cross, spoke the tallest figure, his voice deep and measured. Your loyalty to the Rutledge household has been noted. Few men would undertake the burden you've accepted with such discretion. The man stepped forward, removing his mask to reveal the weathered face of Judge Hamilton, whose courthouse had sentenced 3 enslaved men to hanging just the previous month. We offer you something unprecedented, Hamilton continued. A place among the brethren of the harvest, not as a servant, but as a keeper of secrets. Ezekiel maintained a careful expression, neither eager nor resistant. What would be required of me, sir? Continued care of Catherine Rutledge, Silas interjected, stepping forward, and absolute silence about what you've witnessed. Another man produced a small wooden box containing a silver ring bearing the wheat sheaf emblem. This would mark you as protected. No man in 3 counties would dare raise a hand against you. Ezekiel bowed his head, a perfect performance of humility masking the fury and calculation behind his eyes. I am honored by your trust, he said, accepting the ring. As the strange ceremony concluded and the men dispersed into the night, Ezekiel walked back toward the plantation, the weight of the ring heavy on his finger. He knew now what Catherine had discovered, the extent of the brethren's influence and the depth of their depravity. His mind raced with possibilities. This unexpected elevation wasn't freedom, it was a different kind of chain. But it was also access, information, power that could be turned against them. By the time he reached the edge of the slave quarters, Ezekiel had made his decision. The brethren had unwittingly handed him the key to their destruction. For Catherine's sake, for his lost family, and for every soul suffering under Cypress Grove's shadow, he would bring their entire world crashing down. The rumor spread through Colatin County like wildfire in early June. Catherine Rutledge, the troubled daughter of Cypress Grove's master, had been sent to a prestigious sanatorium in Savannah. Silas Rutledge himself had announced it at the county meeting, his voice carrying just the right note of fatherly concern as he detailed how the specialized treatment would restore his daughter to proper society. The girl needs professional care, he had declared to sympathetic nods from the gathered plantation owners. Sometimes a father must make difficult decisions. In reality, Catherine had never left Cypress Grove. Under cover of darkness, Ezekiel Cross had orchestrated her disappearance, moving her to an abandoned smokehouse at the far edge of the property. The small structure, long forgotten and hidden behind a tangle of kudzu and wild blackberry, provided the perfect sanctuary. Mabel had been instrumental in the deception. The cook had prepared a special meal for the household the night of the supposed departure, slipping a mild sedative into Silas's evening brandy to ensure he slept deeply. She now brought food to the hideaway twice daily, disguising her trips as foraging expeditions for wild herbs. Your father's telling everyone how generous he was to send you to the finest doctors, Mabel whispered one evening, as she delivered a basket of cornbread and stewed greens. Acting like he spent a fortune on your care. Catherine sat cross-legged on her makeshift bed of cotton sacks, her journal open before her. The weeks of detoxification had transformed her. Though still frail, her eyes now held a sharp clarity, and her hands remained steady as she wrote. "Let him believe his own lies," she replied, not looking up from her writing. "It gives us time." Each day, she methodically documented everything she could remember about the Brethren's rituals, from fragments of conversations overheard during her laudanum haze. Ezekiel visited after dusk, bringing news from the main house and the quarters. Together, they compiled a list of enslaved workers who might be willing to join their cause. "The Brethren are planning something for the summer solstice," Ezekiel informed her one night, his voice barely audible over the chorus of cicadas. 3 weeks from now, Catherine nodded, adding the information to her journal in the cipher they had developed together. "Then we have 3 weeks to prepare." While Silas boasted throughout the county about his daughter's treatment, she worked tirelessly from the shadows, memorizing the patterns of the Brethren's gatherings, identifying potential allies, and planning their moment of reckoning. The smokehouse became not just a hiding place, but the center of a growing resistance that would soon shake Cypress Grove to its foundations. The night of June 3rd arrived under a moonless sky. Ezekiel Cross was blindfolded and led through the woods by 2 senior members of the Brethren of the Harvest, their wheat-emblazoned rings glinting in the lantern light. His heart pounded, but his face remained impassive. Months of planning had prepared him for this moment. The underground chamber beneath the old hunting lodge reeked of tallow candles and sweat. When they removed his blindfold, Ezekiel blinked at the 12 hooded figures arranged in a semicircle. Silas Rutledge stood at the center, his eyes feverish with anticipation. "Brothers," Silas announced, "we welcome this man, not as an equal, but as our instrument." The gathered men murmured their approval, unaware that outside, Catherine had positioned herself at the edge of the woods, a lantern ready in her trembling hands. The ritual began with Ezekiel kneeling before a stone altar draped in crimson cloth. One by one, the Brethren approached, reciting oaths in Latin and marking his forehead with ash. When Silas presented the ceremonial dagger, Ezekiel was expected to draw his own blood as a pledge of loyalty. Instead, he knocked the blade from Silas's hand and overturned the altar in one fluid motion. The sacred oils spilled across the floor, catching fire from the nearest candle. Chaos erupted as flames licked up the wooden support beams. "Traitor!" screamed Silas, lunging forward, but Ezekiel was ready. He struck the plantation owner with such force that the man crumpled against the wall. Another Brethren member drew a pistol, but Ezekiel was faster, driving his fist into the man's throat. Above ground, Catherine saw the commotion and raised her lantern 3 times in quick succession. The signal rippled across the plantation as Mabel and 20 others emerged from their cabins with torches and tools. The cook had spent weeks preparing them, whispering instructions while delivering meals to the quarters. Inside the chamber, Ezekiel fought his way toward the exit as smoke filled the underground space. 2 Brethren lay unconscious, others scrambled for escape. He snatched the ledger from its pedestal before kicking open the trapdoor and emerging into the night. The plantation was already transforming. Fires blazed at strategic points: the stables, the overseer's quarters, the main house. Catherine rushed to Ezekiel's side, her face illuminated by the growing inferno. "It's done," she whispered, clutching his bloodied hand. Ezekiel nodded grimly. "Not yet. Your father? Escape through the tunnel. But the others?" Their conversation was cut short by shouts as the enslaved workers of Cypress Grove executed their carefully orchestrated revolt. Some secured escape routes, while others gathered supplies. This was not a mindless rebellion, but a precision strike born of months of secret planning. By midnight, the Brethren's power was broken, their sacred chamber a smoldering ruin. The first phase of Catherine and Ezekiel's reckoning had begun. Dawn broke over Cypress Grove Plantation, painting the sky in hues of orange and red that mirrored the inferno below. The grand estate, once the pride of Colleton County, had become a monument to destruction. Flames licked at the colonial columns of the main house, devouring decades of opulence and cruelty alike. Black smoke billowed into the morning air, visible for miles across the South Carolina landscape. Inside the burning structure, the secret underground chamber where the Brethren of the Harvest had conducted their rituals for generations, collapsed in on itself. The calfskin ledger, with its meticulous records of atrocities, curled and blackened in the heat. Bodies of several brethren lay scattered throughout the grounds, some caught in the blaze, others felled during the night's chaos. Catherine Rutland and Ezekiel Cross watched from the edge of the property as everything her father had built disintegrated. Her face, once pallid from laudanum addiction, now glowed with the reflected firelight. She clutched her journal tightly against her chest, the coded pages containing all the truths the Brethren had tried to bury. "We need to move," Ezekiel whispered, his eyes scanning the tree line for pursuers. The man who had been tasked with her recovery had become her savior and co-conspirator. In his hand, he held a single torn page from the ledger, evidence they might need in the uncertain future ahead. The young woman nodded, her newfound strength evident in her steady gaze. "What about my father?" she asked, searching the chaotic scene for any sign of Silas. "No one's seen him since the fire started," Ezekiel replied, "but men like him have ways of surviving." They slipped away as the first shouts of the county authorities echoed in the distance. The cypress swamp beckoned with its labyrinthine waterways and dense foliage, a natural fortress for those who knew its secrets. Ezekiel led the way, having learned these paths from other enslaved people who had sought temporary refuge here. As they waded deeper into the murky water, Catherine glanced back one last time. The plantation house's roof collapsed in a shower of sparks, erasing the physical center of her imprisonment. Yet she knew the true battle had only begun. The Brethren's influence stretched far beyond these burning walls. "Do you think anyone will believe what really happened here?" she asked, her voice barely audible above the distant crackle of flames. Ezekiel's expression hardened as he helped her over a fallen cypress. "They'll believe what powerful men tell them to believe. But we have this." He nodded toward the journal in her hands. "And sometimes the truth finds a way." They disappeared into the swamp as the sun climbed higher, leaving behind the ashes of one life and carrying the dangerous seeds of another. The news of Cypress Grove's destruction spread through Colleton County like wildfire. Smoke still rose from the charred remains as Sheriff Thomas Wilcox, his silver Brethren ring glinting in the morning light, assembled a posse. "Find that slave Ezekiel Cross," he ordered, his voice carrying across the town square. "He's murdered the Rutland girl and set fire to her daddy's property." Catherine Rutland watched from the edge of the cypress swamp, a shawl pulled low over her face. The young woman's heart pounded as she listened to the lies being woven about her supposed death. Through gaps in the crowd, she spotted familiar faces, men who had attended her father's dinners, who wore wheat sheaf rings identical to the sheriff's. They nodded gravely, offering rewards for Ezekiel's capture. $200 for the murderer, dead or alive," announced Judge Harmon, another Brethren member, his jowls quivering with manufactured outrage. By nightfall, hunting parties with bloodhounds combed the swamps and forests. Catherine huddled in a hollow beneath a fallen cypress, barely breathing, as boots splashed through murky water mere yards away. She clutched her journal to her chest, its pages damp with swamp water but intact, the only record of truth in a county built on lies. 3 days later, she slipped through the darkness to the abandoned rice mill where Ezekiel waited. His face was gaunt with exhaustion, a fresh wound across his shoulder where a bullet had grazed him. "They're saying I killed you," he whispered, passing her a cloth-wrapped bundle of cornbread Mabel had managed to smuggle out. "And that I led 20 others in slaughtering half the household." Catherine's fingers trembled as she took the food. "My father?" "No sign of Silas," Ezekiel replied, but his friends are claiming he died trying to save you." A bitter laugh escaped her lips. He would appreciate the irony. Through the cracked walls of the mill, they could see torches in the distance. Another search party. In town, 3 enslaved men had already been hanged without trial, accused of being Ezekiel's conspirators. "We exposed nothing," Catherine whispered, the weight of failure crushing her chest. "They're burying the truth deeper than before, using our actions to tighten their grip." Ezekiel took her hand, his calloused fingers warm against her skin. "Not nothing," he corrected. "We survived. We have your journal, and now we know exactly who they are." Catherine nodded slowly, understanding the price of their knowledge. The truth had cost them everything: home, safety, identity. But as the torches moved away into the darkness, she realized it was the only currency that mattered now. The abandoned rice mill creaked with the weight of history. Moonlight filtered through broken slats, casting striped shadows across Catherine Rutledge and Ezekiel Cross as they huddled near a small fire. The humid summer air hung heavy around them, carrying the distant sounds of search parties still combing the swamps. "They'll never stop looking for us," Catherine whispered, her once plump frame now gaunt from weeks of running. She clutched her journal to her chest, fingers trembling slightly. Ezekiel nodded, his eyes reflecting the dancing flames. "Not until they believe we're dead, or until they are." In this moment of fragile safety, Catherine finally spoke of what had haunted her. During her captivity, when the laudanum doses occasionally wore thin, she had experienced moments of terrible clarity. 2 household slaves, loyal to her father, had been tasked with ensuring she remained sedated and silent. "When I began to remember the rituals, to write them down," she explained, voice barely audible, "they threatened to tell Silas. I had no choice." Her hands mimicked the motion of pushing someone away, then covered her face. "I smothered one with my pillow. The other I struck with my water pitcher." Ezekiel didn't flinch. Instead, he reached across the space between them, his calloused hand resting briefly on her arm. "Your father told everyone you were mad," he said, "but you were protecting yourself." The confession seemed to break something open between them. Ezekiel stared into the fire and began to speak of his own past, not as the obedient caretaker Silas had presented to society, but as a man with a history deliberately erased. "My wife Sarah was a seamstress," he said, his voice thick with memory. "Our son Benjamin was 7. Ruth had just turned 4. He described how Silas had separated them, selling Sarah and the children to a plantation in Georgia, after Ezekiel had attempted to intercede when the master struck Ruth for spilling water. "I never saw them again," Ezekiel continued. "Later, I learned they died on the journey. Fever took them all." His fist clenched around a small wooden carving, the only remnant of his son's handiwork. Catherine reached for his hand, their fingers intertwining in the firelight. "We are bound now by more than circumstance," she said, her voice finding strength. "What began as my father's punishment has become his undoing." Ezekiel nodded slowly. "This is no longer about survival alone." "No," Catherine agreed. "It's about justice." They sat in silence as the fire burned low, 2 unlikely allies forged in the crucible of shared suffering. Their pact, sealed in the flickering shadows of the abandoned mill, was no longer one of convenience, but of purpose, a bond stronger than the chains that had once defined them. The August heat pressed down on the abandoned rice mill like a weighted blanket. Catherine Rutledge sat cross-legged on the wooden floor, her thin fingers moving methodically across the pages of her journal. The laudanum withdrawal had left her with a clarity she hadn't known in years, and with it came the flood of memories, terrible, precise memories that needed preservation. "I've remembered another name," she whispered, not looking up as Ezekiel entered with a small bundle of food. "Judge Harlow. He was there the night of the spring equinox." Ezekiel set down the provisions and moved closer, watching as she inscribed the name using their private cipher, a complex system of symbols derived from gullah patterns his grandmother had taught him, mixed with Catherine's knowledge of classical languages. "He presided over 3 trials last month," he said quietly. "Sentenced 2 men to hanging for stealing less than the brethren take in a single night." Catherine nodded, her hand never pausing. The journal had become their most precious possession, more valuable than food or weapons. Within its pages lay the architecture of power in Colleton County, names of brethren members, dates of their gatherings, locations of their meeting places, and descriptions of rituals that would shock even the most hardened soul. "Will anyone believe it?" she asked, finally looking up. The sunlight through the broken boards cast stripes across her face, highlighting the determination that had replaced her former vacant stare. "They don't need to believe," Ezekiel replied, his voice low and steady. "They only need to fear that others might." By day, he worked cautiously, making contact with trusted individuals on neighboring plantations. A word here, a whispered promise there, building a network of ears and eyes that stretched across the county. The enslaved community had always maintained hidden channels of communication. And now Ezekiel used these pathways to spread a carefully crafted message. Evidence existed that could bring down the masters, and the day of reckoning was approaching. "I've encoded the Charleston connections," Catherine said, turning the journal to show him a page filled with intricate symbols. "My father's business partners, the shipping magnates, even that missionary who visits twice a year." Ezekiel studied the page, committing the patterns to memory. The young woman before him bore little resemblance to the broken, drug-addled daughter he'd been ordered to care for months ago. Her hands were steady now, her mind sharp as a thorn. "If we're discovered," she began. "If we're discovered, this journal must survive," he finished firmly. "It's not just our story anymore." As twilight fell, Catherine continued writing, preserving truth in a code that only they shared, a language of resistance born from their unlikely alliance. The journal was both their most dangerous possession and their greatest hope, a record that could tear open the festering wounds of Colleton County for all to see. The sweltering July heat pressed down on the abandoned rice mill as Ezekiel Cross carefully unfolded the crumpled message. His calloused fingers traced the words, each one more disturbing than the last. This was the 3rd such message he had intercepted in a fortnight, and the implications sent a chill down his spine, despite the oppressive humidity. "They're everywhere," he murmured, passing the paper to Catherine Rutledge. "Not just here in Colleton." Catherine studied the document, her brow furrowed in concentration. The laudanum fog had long since cleared from her mind, replaced by a sharp clarity that sometimes frightened her. "The Brethren has members in Charleston, Savannah, even Richmond," she whispered. "This changes everything." The pair had established a dangerous routine. Ezekiel would venture into town disguised as a free black tradesman, gathering intelligence from sympathetic contacts. Meanwhile, Catherine decoded intercepted messages using the cipher they had developed together. "Look at these names," she said, pointing to a list. "Judges, bankers, newspaper editors. The Brethren isn't just plantation owners, it's men who control every aspect of society." Ezekiel paced the creaking floorboards, his mind racing. What had begun as a mission of personal justice was expanding into something far more complex. The secret society's tendrils reached into courthouses, banks, and shipping companies across 3 states. "If we expose them here," he reasoned, "they'll simply retreat to their strongholds elsewhere. We need to understand the full extent of their network." Catherine nodded grimly. "And their rituals aren't isolated incidents. They're coordinated." She pulled out her journal, adding new entries in their private code. The summer solstice gatherings happened simultaneously in all 3 cities. Mabel slipped into the mill, carrying a basket covered with a cloth. The cook had become their most trusted ally, moving between worlds with remarkable stealth. "There's talk in town," she reported, setting down provisions. Men with wheat chief rings asking questions about strangers. Ezekiel thanked her with a nod. They're hunting us more systematically now. That night, by lantern light, they mapped what they knew of the Brethren's organization. Catherine's hands trembled slightly as she worked, not from withdrawal, but from the magnitude of what they faced. "We thought destroying Cypress Grove would end this," she said softly, "but we've only scratched the surface." Ezekiel placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Then we dig deeper. Their strength is in their secrecy and their connections. But those same connections can be turned against them." As dawn approached, they understood with grim clarity that their fight had transformed. This was no longer about one plantation, one family's pain, or one man's cruelty. They faced a vast, hidden machine of power that had operated unchecked for generations. The secret they carried had become infinitely more dangerous and more valuable. The golden light of autumn filtered through the cypress trees as Ezekiel Cross made his way to the abandoned rice mill. 3 months had passed since the fire at Cypress Grove, yet the smell of ash seemed to follow him everywhere. Inside the crumbling structure, Catherine Rutledge sat hunched over her journal, her once swollen frame now lean from months of hiding and sparse meals. "Someone was watching the mill," Ezekiel said, his voice low as he secured the door behind him. Catherine looked up, her eyes sharp with concern. "Brethren?" "Not certain, but this was left near the stream." He produced a sealed envelope, its corners stained with what appeared to be dried blood. The letter inside bore the unmistakable seal of the Brethren of the Harvest, a wheat sheaf pressed into wax. Catherine's hands trembled as Ezekiel read the message aloud. A surviving member of the society, Judge Harmon from Richmond, offered Ezekiel a position of power within their reorganized ranks. In exchange, he would be granted the opportunity to personally execute the men who had tortured and killed his wife Sarah and their children. "They're desperate," Catherine whispered. "They've lost control of their narrative." Ezekiel paced the small room, the floorboards creaking beneath his weight. The offer clawed at something primal within him, the chance to look into the eyes of the men who had destroyed his family, to make them suffer as Sarah had suffered. "You can't consider this," Catherine said, rising from her seat. "These men don't honor bargains. They're trying to control you through your pain." "I know what they are," he responded, his voice hollow. Catherine approached him, placing her hand on his arm. "If you become their enforcer, what separates you from them? From my father?" The comparison stung, but Ezekiel recognized its truth. The same rage that had kept him alive now threatened to corrupt everything he and Catherine had built. That night, as the moon cast long shadows through the broken roof, Ezekiel built a small fire in the mill's old hearth. Catherine watched as he held the blood-stained letter over the flames. "My family deserves justice," he said, "not vengeance disguised as honor." The paper caught fire, curling into ash. Catherine added a page from her journal, a coded passage about Judge Harmon and his connections to the Brethren's activities in Richmond. "We'll find another way," she promised, "one that doesn't require becoming monsters ourselves." Ezekiel nodded, watching the flames consume the last of the letter. The temptation hadn't disappeared, but his resolve had solidified. Their path forward couldn't be built on the same foundation of cruelty and power that had defined Cypress Grove for generations. "Justice," he whispered, "not vengeance." The autumn wind carried a chill through the cracks of the abandoned rice mill. Catherine Rutledge paced back and forth, her thin frame casting long shadows against the weathered walls. Her hands trembled, not from laudanum withdrawal anymore, but from rage that seemed to burn hotter with each passing day. "They're still out there," she whispered, clutching a scrap of paper they'd intercepted, news of another Brethren gathering. "Living their lives as if nothing happened, as if they didn't." Her voice broke. Ezekiel looked up from the coded journal entries he was transcribing. "I know," he said softly. "What good is all this? Catherine suddenly erupted, sweeping her arm toward their collection of evidence. We destroy one plantation, expose one chapter, and the system just swallows it up. No one believes us. No one cares. The former slave set down his quill. He'd seen this building in her for weeks, the survivor's rage that had no proper outlet. He understood it intimately. "Sometimes I want to burn it all," she continued, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Every plantation house, every ledger, every man who wears that wheat symbol." Ezekiel crossed the room and took her shaking hands in his. "And then what would be left?" he asked. "Just ashes and more graves." Catherine pulled away, tears streaming down her face. "Then what's the point of knowing the truth if we can't use it?" "We are using it," he replied, "just not how you imagined." That evening, as moonlight filtered through the broken roof, they spread out the remaining pages from the ledger. Instead of focusing on the names of the Brethren members, men who could be blackmailed or exposed, they began mapping the network of plantations, safe houses, and sympathizers. "We can't destroy them all," Ezekiel explained, "but we can create paths around them, through them." Catherine's eyes widened as understanding dawned. "A map for escape. For the next generation," he nodded. "Your father and his friends saw people as property. We'll use their own records to help that property walk away." For the first time in weeks, Catherine smiled. She picked up a quill and began translating the coded entries into practical information. Which overseers could be bribed, which roads were less patrolled, which towns had sympathetic doctors. "This isn't just destruction," she murmured, working through the night. "It's reconstruction." By morning, they had transformed their collection of horrors into something new. A blueprint for freedom that could be passed from hand to hand, whispered from ear to ear. The rage hadn't disappeared, but Catherine had found a way to forge it into something sharper than vengeance: hope. November brought a chill to the air, and whispers of a new underground network spreading through the plantations of Colleton County. Rumors spoke of a mysterious, scarred man named Ezekiel Cross who appeared like a shadow in the night, guiding those who sought freedom toward the North Star. The network operated with clockwork precision. Catherine Rutledge's journal had become more than a record of atrocities. It was now the blueprint for liberation. Pages were carefully torn, encrypted with additional symbols only Ezekiel could interpret, and sewn into the hems and linings of traveling clothes. Each fragment contained routes, safe houses, and warnings about Brethren strongholds along the escape paths. "Remember the words exactly as I've taught you," Ezekiel instructed a young woman preparing for her journey north. His voice was low, his scarred hands steady as he helped her memorize the coded phrases that would identify her to allies. "Speak of harvest only when asked about the weather, and mention cypress trees if you suspect you're being followed." Catherine worked tirelessly alongside him, her frail body strengthened by purpose. The plantation owner's daughter, once deemed broken beyond repair, now channeled her knowledge of the gentry's blind spots into creating undetectable escape routes. She taught women to adopt the mannerisms of house servants on legitimate errands, and men to forge travel papers with the precision she'd learned from years of observing her father's business dealings. Mabel had become their eyes and ears in neighboring plantations, using her connections among the cooking staff to identify those most desperate for escape and those trustworthy enough to shelter others. Her network of informants stretched from the rice fields of South Carolina to the tobacco farms of Virginia. By mid-November, 7 families had vanished from 3 different plantations. The Brethren members were furious, their private communications intercepted by Ezekiel revealing their growing panic. They suspected an organized resistance, but could not imagine its architects were a woman they believed dead and a man they had tried to break. "Each person who escapes carries more than themselves to freedom," Catherine told Ezekiel one evening, as they received word that another family had successfully reached a safe house in North Carolina. "They carry our story, Our truth, Ezekiel nodded, his eyes reflecting the lamplight. And with each telling, the fire spreads. He traced the outline of the journal's cover, thinking of Sarah and their children, from the lowlands to the mountains. They'll know what happened at Cypress Grove wasn't madness or rebellion. It was justice beginning to awaken. As winter approached, the network grew stronger. The stories of Cypress Grove traveled northward with each escapee, lighting small fires of resistance that the brethren could not extinguish. Fires that would eventually connect and burn much brighter than anyone could imagine. The full moon cast long shadows across the charred remains of Cypress Grove Plantation. Ezekiel Cross moved like a ghost through the skeletal ruins, his footsteps barely disturbing the ash that had settled like snow. 4 months had passed since the fire, yet the acrid smell of smoke still hung in the air, mingling with the earthy scent of decay. He had come for one thing only, the final page of the Brethren's ledger that might have survived the flames. That page contained the cold, clinical account of what had happened to Sarah, Benjamin, and Ruth, his family, their names reduced to inventory in Silas Rutledge's cruel ledger. The cellar entrance was partially collapsed, forcing Ezekiel to squeeze through a narrow opening. Inside, moonlight filtered through the broken floorboards above, illuminating dancing particles of dust and ash. He knelt where the hidden compartment had been, fingers carefully sifting through debris. Nothing, he whispered to the darkness, nothing left. For hours he searched, moving stones and charred timbers until his hands were raw and bleeding. But the fire had been thorough in its consumption. Where the ledger had been hidden, only ashes remained, the last physical evidence of his family's fate reduced to dust. Under the indifferent gaze of the moon, Ezekiel fell to his knees. For the first time since that terrible day when he'd found their bodies, he allowed himself to weep openly. His tears fell silently, darkening the ash beneath him. "I thought I needed proof," he said to the empty ruins, "something to hold." When he returned to their hideout near dawn, Catherine Rutledge was waiting. She took one look at his ash-covered clothing and bloodied hands and understood. Without speaking, she cleaned his wounds with water from their dwindling supply, her touch gentle but firm. "You found nothing," she said finally. It wasn't a question. "The fire took it all," Ezekiel replied, his voice hollow. "Every record, every name." Catherine's eyes, once clouded by laudanum, were now clear and steady. "The pages are gone, but the truth isn't," she said. "Look at what we've done." She gestured to the small table where scraps of fabric lay, pieces of clothing with coded messages sewn into the seams, ready to be distributed to those fleeing north. 23 people free last month, 17 more preparing to leave. Your wife and children, they live in these messages, in every person who escapes because of what we've built. Ezekiel looked at the fabric scraps, each containing fragments of their shared knowledge. Not written in ink on paper that could burn, but carried in flesh and blood that would endure. "Our legacy isn't in those ashes," Catherine said softly. "It's in the living who carry our story forward." The first frost of December settled over Colleton County, glazing the rebuilt structures with a deceptive purity. Catherine Rutledge watched from the edge of the woods as workers raised new beams where Cypress Grove's main house once stood. Her breath formed small clouds in the morning air, her once frail body now hardened by months of survival. "They're determined to erase what happened," she whispered to Ezekiel, who stood beside her, a woolen cap pulled low over his face. "But they can't erase what we remember," he replied, his voice carrying the weight of all they had witnessed. The county had quickly manufactured its own version of events: a tragic fire, a regrettable loss of property, an unfortunate incident of slave unrest. The Brethren's surviving members had closed ranks, burying their secrets beneath new foundations and fresh paint. From Charleston to Richmond, their influence remained. Though weakened by the blow struck at Cypress Grove, Catherine and Ezekiel moved like shadows through the winter landscape, their existence a whispered rumor among those who had reason to fear them. The daughter of Silas Rutledge was officially declared dead, her body supposedly found in the ashes. The enslaved man was branded a murderer, with a bounty that ensured they could never show their faces in daylight. "Sometimes I wonder if we accomplished anything at all," Catherine said one evening as they huddled by a small fire in an abandoned hunting cabin. Her journal lay open beside her, its pages filled with coded testimony that might never see justice. Ezekiel looked up from the letter he was preparing, one of many that would travel north with those seeking freedom. "Look around you," he said. "3 families will reach Pennsylvania because of what we've done. The Brethren lost 6 of their leaders. Your father's legacy is ashes." That night, as snow began to fall, they received word through Mabel that 2 more plantations had experienced unexplained fires in their record houses. No lives were lost, but ledgers and ownership documents had mysteriously vanished. "The silence is becoming their enemy," Catherine observed, a thin smile crossing her face. "When people stop speaking out of fear, they start acting instead." By Christmas, the county's facade of normalcy had been restored, but beneath it ran currents of unease. Enslaved workers exchanged glances loaded with unspoken knowledge. Plantation owners doubled their guards. The system continued, wounded but adapting. Catherine knew their victory was incomplete. The journal she kept would likely never be published, the crimes never prosecuted. But she and Ezekiel had transformed silence from a tool of oppression into a weapon of resistance. In the quiet of winter, their legacy spread, not in courtrooms or newspapers, but in whispers, in coded messages, in acts of defiance too small to punish, but too numerous to stop. The cost had been enormous. But as the year drew to a close, Catherine knew they had planted seeds that would grow long after their names were forgotten. The truth of Cypress Grove never made the papers. The Charleston Mercury printed only a brief notice about a regrettable incident at the Rutledge estate, while the Richmond Enquirer dismissed it as slave unrest promptly contained. No mention was made of the Brethren of the Harvest, whose surviving members closed ranks and buried their secrets deeper than before. Instead, the real story lived in Catherine Rutledge's coded journal, its pages now distributed among trusted hands throughout the Low Country. It survived in the songs hummed by women washing clothes along the riverbanks, melodies that seemed innocent but carried warnings and meeting times within their verses. It persisted in the patterns quilted by former house servants, each stitch a letter, each square a message of resistance. "They'll try to erase us," Catherine whispered one evening as she and Ezekiel Cross watched the sun set over the marshlands from their hideaway in an abandoned rice mill. Her once frail frame had grown stronger, though the scars of her laudanum addiction would never fully heal. Ezekiel nodded, his dark eyes reflecting the dying light. "But memory is stronger than their lies." He thought of Sarah, Benjamin, and Ruth, the family Silas had destroyed, and felt their presence like a physical weight against his heart. "What we've started won't end with us." Throughout Colleton County, whispers continued about the daughter and the enslaved man who had vanished into legend. Some claimed they had died in the flames, others insisted they had escaped north. The most fearful among the plantation owners spoke in hushed tones about sightings, a scarred black man and a thin white woman, appearing like ghosts to guide others to freedom. By December, frost had touched the cypress trees, and Mabel, now working in a Charleston household, continued passing messages through the network they had established. 3 more enslaved families had disappeared from neighboring plantations, leaving behind only carefully arranged personal items, signals that they had not been captured, but had chosen their moment to flee. Catherine and Ezekiel knew their reckoning was only the beginning. The Brethren's power stretched beyond South Carolina, with tentacles reaching into Virginia and Georgia. Their work would take years, perhaps decades, a slow dismantling of corrupt foundations. Do you ever regret it? Catherine asked one night as they added new codes to their journal by candlelight. Ezekiel looked at her, the woman society had discarded and his people had once distrusted. "Not for a moment," he answered. And as winter fell on the low country, the fires of justice smoldered quietly beneath the surface of southern gentility, waiting for the next wind to rise and fan them into flame.